This is the journalist who wrote the expose saying, and now here's the UN finally putting out a report saying essentially this. Here is the most recent UN Secretary General report on sexual violence on October 7th. You're not going to hear a lot of this from your mainstream media right now. They're not really harping on this. Within that report, the mission team, specifically the forensic pathologists and the digital analysts, reviewed over 5,000 photos, around 50 hours, and several audio files of footage of the attacks. And it goes into all the details: militants, body cams, dash cams, CCTV, traffic surveillance, individual cell phones, cameras, all the footage. And so we're talking about a lot of footage of the dead Hamas fighters, of other dead people. So this is not stuff that had any chance to be purged of footage of sexual violence, or even just evidence of it, even if it wasn't the full footage. So the report continues. In the medico-legal assessment of available photos and videos, no tangible indications of rape could be identified. While the mission team reviewed extensive digital material depicting a range of egregious violations, no digital evidence specifically depicting acts of sexual violence was found in open sources. So this is the UN, again, admitting that they've found zero evidence of sexual violence on October 7th. You may be wondering, why does the sexual violence component of this matter so much when obviously there was murder on October 7th? Hamas murdered people. IDF murdered people. There were people that were not Hamas or IDF that were involved in shooting and killing. Why is there so much focus on sexual violence when we've seen zero evidence of it? Well, because Israel has done testing and found that people around the world apparently are far more disturbed by sexual violence, like weaponizing sexual violence, rape, using it as a tactic in war. They're far more bothered by that than they are by just hearing about murders. And so Israel and their propagandists have worked very hard to make you believe that there was this crazy amount of sexual violence on October 7th, while we have seen zero evidence of it. And of course, I've done debunking of the New York Times expose, which New York Times also backed off of. I've done debunking of, other aspects of it that they were trying, that they tried to cover. The previous UN report that said that they couldn't find any evidence, but that they spoke to Israeli officials, and Israeli officials told them, oh yeah, loads of sexual violence. And just to complete, here is a paragraph from Haaretz, which is a mainstream outlet in Israel. And by the way, Haaretz is a pro-Israel outlet. Now, they are lighter on the propaganda for Israel than some of the outlets in Israel, but they are still a pro-Israel outlet. And here they say, beyond this, so beyond the UN report, from inquiries put to 3 bodies in the defense establishment, the Israeli defense establishment, it emerges that the intelligence material collected by the police and the intelligence bodies, including footage from terrorist body cameras, does not contain visual documentation of any acts of rape themselves. So this is a pro-Israel outlet saying they spoke to defense officials, to other Israeli intelligence bodies, and have also found zero evidence of sexual violence on October 7th. Here's another quote within the report, within the UN report. While the mission team, the UN's mission team, was able to meet with some released hostages as well as with some survivors and witnesses of the attacks, it did not meet with any survivor victim of sexual violence from October 7th, despite concerted efforts encouraging them to come forward. There's 2 possibilities for why they could not find a single sexual violence survivor from October 7th. One possibility is there wasn't sexual violence. There was plenty of other stuff, but there wasn't sexual violence. And 2 is that the victims of sexual violence were murdered, or by IDF, by tanks, or by Hamas. Anyone who says, well, there aren't survivors because they were murdered, okay, that's you can make that argument, but you then have to come up with some kind of evidence at all to show that there was sexual violence and then the survivors were murdered. But none of that has been brought forward. The only stories of sexual violence that have been brought forward were brought forward by people that have been proven liars, that have lied about other things, that have, provably lied about various aspects of what went down on October 7th. One of the famous ones was there were two girls, I think maybe they said twin girls, who had been violated or raped or something, and then their bodies were found in the room and And it turns out there's no girls that fit that description in all of the bodies from October 7th. The stories have all fallen apart. The Intercept did a great debunking, which I just want to remind everyone of the New York Times expose on sexual violence, which the New York Times has also backed away from. The Intercept report was Between the Hammer and the Anvil. One of the main journalists, there were only 3 on that report, but one of the main ones, and the main one in Israel, was Anat Schwartz. But she is not a journalist, had never worked for the New York Times before, and she was basically given the task of unearthing sexual violence on October 7th. To read from the article for a second, Anat Schwartz had a problem. The Israeli filmmaker and former Air Force intelligence official had been assigned by the New York Times to work with her partner's nephew, Adam Sella, and veteran Times reporter Jeffrey Gettleman and Gettleman famous, I've played the clip, Gettleman famously said his job is not to find any evidence. He said his job is to tell the story, literally in front of a panel. He said his job is to tell the story and not have any evidence for it, which is a fascinating thing for a journalist to say. An investigation into sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th that could reshape the way the world understood Israel's ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. And I'm not going to go through all this because I already did it on an episode once, but let me just do this one key piece. In a podcast interview, Schwartz details her extensive efforts to get confirmation about sexual violence from Israel's hospitals, rape crisis centers, trauma recovery facilities, and sex assault hotlines in Israel, as well as her inability to get a single confirmation from any of them. And the Times has said, quote, she was told there had been no complaints made of sexual assaults, unquote, the Times spokesperson acknowledged. If you want to claim that all the people who were sexually assaulted are dead, there are plenty of people who were in and around everything that happened on October 7th who are not dead. And none of them are claiming that they had evidence of or heard of sexual violence either. She says in her podcast interview, that she couldn't find anyone. And she says, like, no complaint of sexual assault was received. That's her in the podcast interview. She said, I had a lot of interviews which didn't lead anywhere. Like, I would go to all kinds of psychiatric hospitals, sit in front of the staff. All of them are fully committed to the mission, and no one had met a victim of sexual assault. The next step was to call the manager of sexual assault hotline in Israel's south, which proved equally fruitless. The manager told her they had no reports of sexual violence. Did anyone call you? Did you hear anything? And the answer was no, no, no. This is the journalist who wrote the expose saying Hamas weaponized sexual violence. It's unbelievable. And now here's the UN finally putting out a report saying essentially this. There is not evidence of it.